Most people feel something different when they read the Old Testament versus the New Testament. The Old Testament feels heavy, severe, almost frightening. The New Testament feels warmer, more forgiving, more like home. And for years, people have asked, why? Did God change? Or did something change in you? The answer is neither. The answer is psychology. The Bible is one book, but it contains two very different emotional worlds. In the Old Testament, you have a God who floods the earth, commands armies, strikes people dead for touching the wrong object, and demands absolute obedience under threat of destruction. In the New Testament, you have Jesus eating with sinners, telling a father to run toward his rebellious son, and forgiving the people who are nailing him to a cross. Same God, same story, completely different emotional register. And for centuries, theologians have tried to explain this. But today, we are not going to approach this theologically. We are going to approach it psychologically. Because when you look at these two testaments through the lens of developmental psychology, attachment theory, trauma response, and moral evolution, something extraordinary happens. The Bible stops looking like a contradiction and starts looking like the most accurate psychological portrait of the human journey ever written. Let us go deeper. To understand the psychology of the Old Testament, you first need to understand one thing. The people it was written for were not like you. They were not sitting in comfortable homes with access to education, therapy, and self-help books. They were tribes, nomadic, vulnerable, constantly threatened by famine, war, disease, and neighboring powers that wanted to destroy them. Their world was brutal, unpredictable, terrifying, and in that world, the primary psychological need was not love and belonging. It was survival. Psychologists who study moral development, particularly Lawrence Kohlberg, describe the earliest stage of moral reasoning as the pre-conventional stage. At this stage, a person or a culture behaves morally not because they understand why something is right, but because they fear the consequences of doing wrong. You obey because you are afraid of punishment. You follow the rules because breaking them means destruction. This is not immaturity. This is survival psychology. And the laws of the Old Testament map almost perfectly onto this framework. The Ten Commandments are not presented as invitations. They are presented as commands with consequences attached. Do not murder, do not steal, do not worship other gods. Why? Because if you do, here's what happens to you. This is what psychologists call authoritarian attachment, a relationship structure built on absolute authority, clear rules, and predictable punishment for violations. And for a traumatized, vulnerable, tribal people who needed order above everything else, this framework was not cruel. It was exactly what they needed. Think of it this way. A child growing up in genuine danger needs strong, firm, non-negotiable boundaries to feel safe. They do not need you to explain the nuance of every rule. They need to know clearly, do this, and you are safe, do that, and there are consequences. That is the psychology the Old Testament was operating within. And here is the emotional storytelling moment that will make this real. There is a story in 2 Samuel chapter 6 that disturbs almost everyone who reads it. The Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object in Israel, is being transported on a cart. The oxen stumble. The ark starts to tip. A man named Uzzah reaches out his hand to steady it, to stop it from falling, and God strikes him dead on the spot. Most people read this and feel confusion, then anger, then unease. He was trying to help. Why would God kill him for that? But look at this psychologically. In a culture operating on survival-based, fear-motivated morality, the boundaries around the sacred cannot be situational. They cannot be, well, it depends on your intention. Because once you introduce situational exceptions into an absolute rule, the entire framework of order begins to collapse. This is the same psychology behind why military cultures enforce strict protocols even when they seem illogical in the moment. It is not about that specific moment. It is about maintaining the integrity of a structure that keeps everything else together. The Old Testament God was not just a spiritual figure. Psychologically, he was functioning as what attachment theorists call a regulating force, an external authority powerful enough to hold together a people who had not yet developed the internal psychological structure to regulate themselves. That is the Old Testament. And it served its purpose. Then something shifts. And the shift is so dramatic that people have spent 2,000 years debating what it means. Jesus arrives, and almost immediately, he starts dismantling the behavioral framework of the Old Testament, not the values, but the mechanism. He says, "You have heard it said, 'Do not murder.' But I say to you, do not even hate your brother in your heart." He moves the standard from behavior to internal state, from external compliance to internal transformation. He says, "The greatest commandment is to love God with all your heart, and the second is to love your neighbor as yourself." He reduces an entire legal system, 613 commandments in Jewish tradition, to two internal orientations: love God, love people. This is not a simplification. This is a complete psychological upgrade. Kohlberg's model of moral development describes the highest stage of moral reasoning as the post-conventional stage, where a person no longer behaves morally because they fear punishment or want social approval. They behave morally because they have internalized the value of human dignity and they genuinely care. They do not need the law to tell them not to steal from their neighbor because they already feel their neighbor's humanity. This is what Jesus was calling people toward. Not just new rules, a new internal architecture. And psychologically, this maps directly onto what John Bowlby called secure attachment. In secure attachment, a child does not obey their parent primarily out of fear of punishment. They internalize their parents' values because they feel genuinely loved and safe. The behavior becomes an expression of the relationship, not a transaction to avoid consequences. The New Testament is the transition from a fear-based relationship with God to a love-based one. And here is the emotional story that will make this impossible to forget. A crowd drags a woman to Jesus. She has been caught in adultery. Under the law of Moses, the Old Testament law, the punishment is death by stoning. The crowd is ready. The stones are in their hands. They look at Jesus and ask, "The law says stone her. What do you say?" It is a trap. If he says stone her, he contradicts his message of grace. If he says let her go, he contradicts the law. Jesus does not answer immediately. He bends down and writes something in the dust. We do not know what he wrote. The Bible never tells us. Then he stands and says, "Let anyone among you who has never sinned throw the first stone." And he bends back down. One by one, starting with the oldest, the crowd drops their stones and walks away, until only the woman is standing there. Jesus looks up. "Where are your accusers? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, Lord," she says. "Then neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." In that moment, Jesus does not abolish the moral standard. He does not say what she did was acceptable. But he refuses to use shame, punishment, and public humiliation as the tools of moral correction. Instead, he uses dignity, mercy, and a direct personal invitation to change. This is the psychology of the New Testament in one scene. The goal is not compliance through fear. The goal is transformation through love. Here is the question that sits at the center of everything we have covered. If God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, why does he feel so different across these two testaments? Psychologists who study religious experience have a fascinating answer. The difference is not in God. The difference is in what the human psyche was capable of receiving at each stage. Think about how a parent raises a child. When that child is 5 years old, the parent sets firm, non-negotiable rules. Do not run into the road. Do not touch the stove. Do not hit your sister. The reasons are not always explained. The child is not always consulted, because a 5-year-old does not have the cognitive or emotional development to weigh consequences the way an adult can. But as the child grows, as their brain develops, as they build empathy, as they begin to understand cause and effect, the parent's approach changes. The rules become conversations, the punishments become discussions, the authority becomes guidance. The parent did not change. The relationship evolved because the child evolved. And this is exactly the framework theologian Walter Brueggemann uses when he describes the progression from the Old Testament to the New Testament. He calls it the maturation of the covenant. The Old Testament represents God meeting humanity, where it was tribal, fear-based, externally regulated. The New Testament represents the next stage, a humanity that has developed enough internal capacity to receive a different kind of relationship, one based not on fear of consequences, but on the freely chosen response to love. And here is why this matters for you personally. Most people who grew up in strict, rule-based religious environments carry what psychologists call authoritarian religious trauma, a deep association between God and judgment, between spirituality and fear, between faith and the feeling of never being enough. They read the Old Testament and recognize that feeling because it mirrors the psychological framework of their early religious experience. And they struggle with the New Testament because love-based relationships for people conditioned by fear feel unreliable. If there are no consequences, how do I know the rules are real? If I am forgiven no matter what, does any of this mean anything? This is not a theological crisis. This is attachment psychology playing out in a spiritual context. Here is where most people get this wrong. They treat the Old Testament and the New Testament as contradictions, as if one is the mistake and the other is the correction. But psychology does not see them that way. Psychology sees them as two stages of the same developmental arc. You cannot skip the Old Testament stage. You cannot develop genuine love-based morality without first passing through the stage of fear-based structure. Children who grow up with no rules, no boundaries, no consequences, they do not become more loving adults. They become adults without the internal structure to sustain genuine love. The Old Testament built the container. The New Testament filled it. The fear of God in the Old Testament was not the destination. It was the foundation. And what the New Testament tells us is this: once the foundation is laid, once the structure exists, there is something higher available to you. You do not have to live in the fear stage forever. You can move into the love stage. But you can only access the love stage if you are willing to do the harder internal work. Because fear-based morality is easy. The rule is clear. You obey or you suffer. Love-based morality is harder. It requires you to actually examine your internal state, to ask not just did I follow the rule, but am I becoming the kind of person who does not need the rule? That is the psychological journey from Genesis to Revelation. And it is the same journey every human being takes, if they are willing. The Old Testament shows you a God who meets you in your fear. The New Testament shows you a God who invites you into something beyond it. And here's the thing that no one talks about in church. Most of us are still living in Old Testament psychology. We are still motivated primarily by what we are afraid of failure, afraid of judgment, afraid of not being enough. We have access to the New Testament, but we are reading it with an Old Testament mind. And the entire psychological arc of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation is pointing you toward one transformation. From a person who does the right thing because they are afraid of what happens if they do not, to a person who does the right thing because they have become someone who genuinely loves. That is the journey. And the question the Bible is asking you on every single page is this: where are you on it? If this video shifted something in how you see these two testaments, I want to know. Comment below. Are you living more in Old Testament psychology or New Testament psychology right now? Be honest. The comments on this channel are a safe space. And if you want me to keep going deeper into the psychology of scripture, breaking down the stories, the characters, the frameworks that the Bible documented before modern science caught up, hit subscribe. Because next, we are going to look at the psychology of the Psalms, why David's emotional honesty in those poems is more therapeutic than most modern therapy sessions. You do not want to miss that one.